Namaskar, I'm Dr. Medha Bisht. I teach international relations at the South Asian University based in New Delhi. I want to thank HRDC JNU for inviting me, and for the next half an hour or so, I will be speaking on Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now, when we think about Arthashastra, it's a classic, and when we think about classics, classics are subliminal in character, which means that they enthrall the minds of the young, of the old, across generations. Often composed in a specific socio-historic cultural moment, classics often have a universal appeal. Now, when we think about Arthashastra, it is a non-Western classic. The text, interestingly, emphasizes on understanding the political, which I would say has a larger ramification to understand the nature of state and statecraft. Now, let me add here that the nature of state and statecraft is idyllic in nature. It's an ideal type. And I would like to borrow Weber's phrase here, who in fact says an ideal type is a benchmark to identify similarities and differences. While it is not a moral ideal, it can be used for developing hypotheses to advance knowledge. To just speak a bit on the importance of non-Western classics and why are non-Western classics important. Non-Western classics are important because, to my mind, they help us to understand multiple thought ways and in fact familiarize us with a genre of epistemic practices which in fact stem from specific geocultural spaces. Significantly, reading classics also helps us emancipate ideas which are non-Western and helps us to decolonize disciplines such as international relations, which were primarily built on a European experience, if one might call that, and also Western political thought. A classic reflection of such an uncognitive bias, I would say, really goes to the interpretations of Arthashastra, where it has been said that it is bereft of any moral value. So to begin with, and before I introduce Arthashastra to you, I would say that Arthashastra is a reflexive text. A striking pattern which emerges from Arthashastra is its emphasis on dharma, interpreted as order, and how the meaning and regulation of this order becomes the teleological purpose behind the idea of state and statecraft. Now, dharma, interestingly, in Hindu philosophy, was not equated with a theocratic framework, but understood more as a way of life, which became, I would say, a normative guide for the king and the subjects in political and social affairs. In the idyllic state of Kautilya, dharma thus became the reflective basis for quote-unquote knowing, understanding, and judging the political phenomena. Now, let me introduce Arthashastra to you. Let me flag off some facts, some insights, which I think are pertinent to our understanding of this text. Arthashastra is essentially, as I've said, a classic, a non-Western classic, which was written between the 2nd and the 4th century CE. It was discovered in 1905 in Grantha script, edited and published in 1909, and then translated in English in 1915. The intellectual discussion of Arthashastra has actually animated the debate. And I would say that you can broadly divide this debate into two parts. The first part is where scholars really try to identify the author, the identity of the author and the text. And the second part primarily looks at the periodization of Arthashastra. In fact, there is an interesting debate where Kautilya has been called a myth, and some even say perhaps there was a Kautilyan school which perhaps needs our attention. So Kautilya's Arthashastra, to my mind, is an exemplar. It's an exemplar of how philosophy and strategy were reconciled, conceptualized, and endowed meaning to the political, which of course was legitimate activity. It articulated norms and the limits of state action. Kautilya's definition of political was not only about placing the political institutions as an organized structure, the state, at the center of political activity, but it also emphasized, as I said, the limits of political action when it came to physical and natural environment. And if you remember, Thomas Trotman's excellent book, Elephants in Ancient India, is quite a testimony to this. So what includes the political? I would say, the way Kautilya defines it, the center of political activity was to provide prosperity, that is labha, and enhance security, that was palana. The duties of the ruler were raksha, that is protection of state from external aggression, palana, which was palan, which was maintenance of law and order in the state, and yogashema. Yogashema was primarily safeguarding the welfare of the people. Now these duties in many ways defined the boundaries of the political, and steps were taken to minimize factors which could jeopardize this idea. I would like to draw your attention to the two phrases here, Kootaniti and Rajaniti, when I'm talking about political. So when I say that Kautilya is a text on the internal aspects of the state, here I mean that Kautilya is definitely a text on Rajaniti. And yes, it is also a text which draws our attention to external facets, activities of the state. And this, I would say, is Kootaniti. So the ideational organization of the political, I would say, is an important material manifestation towards understanding the state. Insights towards an approach which exhibit elements of the political were very much a constitutive part of the spiritual, the economic, the civil, the social, which I would say broadly defined what political was. In Arthashastra, interestingly, there is a continuous pattern of interaction or interdependence between elements, which Kautilya says are constituent elements. And these constituent elements, in fact, establish the link between internal, that is state, and the external, that is statecraft realm. The relevance of this understanding to the discipline of IR is that it offers a revisionist case for understanding Arthashastra, liberating it from the narrow frames of realpolitik. And this understanding, I would say, give meaning to vocabularies which we so often use as students of international relations. And these vocabularies are morality, order, power, which I think are central towards making sense of state and statecraft in Arthashastra. So I'm going to offer two propositions here, which I think are very important. The first is, as I just pointed out, there is a continuous pattern in terms of the interdependence and causality of variables, which were the constituent elements that were established between the internal, that is the state, and the external, that is the statecraft realm, the first point to remember. And the second point to remember is that Arthashastra is indeed very relevant to the discipline of international relations. And here, what we will focus on today, we will try to understand, we'll make a revisionist case for understanding Arthashastra, liberating it from the narrow frames of realpolitik. So let me focus on the two legs of the larger presentation, which is the Saptanga theory, primarily, which I'll convey through the understanding of state, and the Mandala, which I will convey through the understanding of statecraft. Now, if you look at the 7 constituents of the Saptanga theory, what one understands is that there was a pluralistic understanding of power. And why am I saying that? Because the 7 elements of the Saptanga theory, which was the king, the leader, was one of the primary elements. This was really the moral force. The second element was Council of Ministers, which primarily signified intellectual power. The third was territory and population, which primarily focused on legitimate and moral power. The fourth was forts, which primarily talked about defensive power. The fifth was treasury, which talked about economic power. The sixth was army, which talked about offensive power. And finally, the seventh is Mitra, the ally. Interestingly, one of the most important seventh elements of the state, which belongs to an external category. Now, definitely, the ordering of these seven constituent elements is very interesting. Each of these seven elements had certain excellencies, which are elaborated by Kautilya in his Arthashastra. And these excellencies were outstanding features which had a central objective of giving stability and order to the state. The effort was how to really hone, how to really sharpen, how to really cultivate these seven elements, the outstanding elements of the state. Now, these excellencies, as Kautilya calls them, also specified the primary parameters of each of the elements that constituted the state. Thus, what I understand from this and what I would like to emphasize through this is that the entity, and understand this as the state, was not given, but it evolved organically, and the character of the entity or the character of the state could be influenced by its dominant features, which determined then whether a state was an inferior state or a superior state. Therefore, these excellencies and outstanding elements were very important to be cultivated. Now, let me just take you to Mandala. Now, Mandala has a spatial understanding to it. There is a geographical determinism which we associate with the concept itself. But interestingly, I would perhaps try to emphasize here that Mandala, yes, had a spatial connotation, but it also had a cognitive connotation. And when I talk about the cognitive connotation, I primarily look at the words motivation and intention. So, what was the mandala used for? Mandala was used to identify the enemy and the friend. And interestingly, Kautilya, different types of enemies and different types of friends. So when he's talking about enemies, or Ari as he called them, they were destroyable enemies, they were dangerous enemies, they were vulnerable enemies. And when he talks about Mitra, they were dangerous friends, they were worthy friends, and they were best friends. Now, I think this classification is very important to really understand the cognitive dimension, which is often overlooked, because most of the time we have an element of geographical determinism when we talk about the friend and the enemy through the circle of states, which is the mandala. Now, when we talk about these two aspects of motivation and intention, let me draw your attention to a very interesting fact. How does Kautilya, or what does Kautilya suggest to really identify the motivation of an actor? And Kautilya says that motivation stems from the internal cohesion of the seven constituent elements. We just talked about the seven constituent elements in the Saptanga theory. All these seven constituent elements had some outstanding features. So the state or the entity which had all the seven constituent elements in place could be a potential enemy and could be a potential friend too. So therefore, the cohesiveness of the state was very much dependent on the seven constituent elements. Now, if you look at the intention is again very important for Kautilya, because he says that once you understand the intent of the actor, it really determines the method which needs to be employed in terms of, quote unquote, I would say, diplomatically engaging him. Now, when you look at the mandala, and the circle of states definitely has been the center of a lot of strategic debates, strategic narratives, but there are five primary actors that Kautilya talks about. And these actors, I would say, the aspirant power, the conqueror, which is the Vijigishu, any state could in fact become an aspiring power. Any state could aspire to become a Vijigishu. And that's very interesting again. But there were 4 other actors, and the 4 other actors were classified as the ally, the enemy, the middle power, and the neutral power. And I would say that the permutations and the combinations between these actors really determined the direction of diplomacy or diplomatic engagement. So as I said, there are 2 other actors apart from the Mitra and the enemy, the Ari, and which are the Madhyaman or the middle power and the Udasin, which is the neutral power. In fact, one can say that the Madhyaman and the Udasin are 2 negotiators. It was really important for the aspirational power or the conqueror to have good contacts or good relationship with the Madhyaman and the Udasin, because they really helped in trying to balance the situation. So if you look at the mandala, the circle of states, at the center is the Vijigishu, then is the enemy, then is the enemy's ally, and this this goes on again and again. Now, one way to perhaps depict it, I would say graphically, is through the spoke and the hub model. And here I would like to take this quote from Arthashastra itself, where Kautilya says, "Making the king separated by one intervening territory, the felly, and those immediately proximate to spokes, the leader should stretch himself out as the hub in the circle of constituents. For the enemy situated between the two, the leader and the ally, becomes easy to exterminate even if strong." And I would say that this is indeed a very instructive statement. An instructive statement because what it conveys to us is that state and statecraft were interconnected to each other. A good enemy, or a potentially strong enemy, was the one who in fact had all the 7 constituent elements in place and therefore had a strong state capacity. On the other hand, a vulnerable enemy was the one which did not have the 7 constituent elements of the state and therefore was vulnerable. And I think this categorization is very important, and therefore state and statecraft cannot be really delinked in Arthashastra. Internal and external cannot be really delinked from Arthashastra. Also, there is one specific aspect which I would like to highlight here, which perhaps is ignored. And this is that the mandala had 72 constituent elements in place. Yes, this is mentioned in Arthashastra. So where the state had 7 constituent elements, mandala had 72 constituent elements. And in fact, Kautilya specifies or mentions specific stratagems for keeping these 72 constituent elements in order. In fact, the most powerful state was the one which had its 7 constituents in place, and how the 7 elements could be strengthened and enhanced by forging external alliances was primarily the end goal of statecraft. So when we are really talking about the external alliances, I would like to draw your attention on the 6 measures of foreign policy which Kautilya talks about. But before I get into the Shadgunya theory or the 6 measures of foreign policy, let me briefly talk about these 72 constituent elements which I just mentioned. So essentially, and this again is detailed in the text, there were 4 circles, and we can call them 4 sub-circles. Each circle had 3 players. The first, the center, you could say, was the aspiring state or the Vijigishu. The circle beyond the aspiring state was the ally. And the third circle was again the ally's ally. And all these, the way Kautilya says we should choose our friend and enemy, is really based on these 7 constituent elements. So a state which is proximate to these 7 constituent elements or which has a high capacity should be chosen as allies. And as I said, there is a differentiation to allies as Kautilya mentions. Then, yes, and therefore there were 6 plus 6 plus 6, 18 constituent elements in the first circle. Now let's come to subcircle 2. In the subcircle 2, the ambitious state or the Vijigishu is at the center, followed by the enemy's ally and the enemy. And that again is very important because it's significantly important then to again see what these 7 constituent elements were, of a potential enemy or of a potential enemy's ally. Unless or until you had a very, I would say, cognitive way of understanding these 7 constituent elements, one could not really recognize a potential enemy. And again, Kautilya really talks about the dangerous enemy and the vulnerable enemy, etc. And then again, this had 6 plus 6 plus 6 elements, which were 18 elements. Now let's come to subcircle 3. The subcircle 3 again had the ambitious state or the Vijigishu at the center, followed by the neutral power and also followed by the enemy and then also by the neutral power. And as I said, neutral power was supposed to be an important negotiator. So therefore, when you choose the neutral power, you again need to look at the 7 constituent elements because that would really help in trying to change the behavior of the enemy. So again, the 6 plus 6 plus 6 elements become important here, that is 18, and then finally I come to subcircle 4, which is again the center is the Vijigishu or the ambitious state, followed by the enemy and the middle power. The middle power is again the negotiator here, and again, one of the ways through which you identify a potential negotiator as a middle power is by looking at its 7 constituent elements, because the 7 constituent elements are primarily indicative of the capacity of the state, how inferior or superior a state is. Now let's really come to the operative principles to activate foreign policy that Kautilya talks about. And I would say that Kautilya actually mentions 6 methods of foreign policy, the Shadgunya theory. Again, very instructive, because what these 6 elements of foreign policy tell us, they essentially tell us that Kautilyan strategy is suggestive of a strategy full of dynamism. It is suggestive of a strategy which is fluid, which changes according to the change in the political environment and which is susceptible to change. And therefore, one can have a look at it, one really looks at these 6 methods of foreign policy. So what was the first method? The first method was peace. Peace necessarily did not mean perpetual peace, but peace primarily meant managing the relations or entering into a compact so that one could minimize the threats from a potential enemy, and that's important. The second was war. And war again is very important here because war didn't really mean really going out or marching, but it primarily meant injury or hostility. It was primarily indicative, I would say, of weakening the enemy through various strategies and tactics. So I would say war was as much a political strategy here as it was a military strategy. And that I think again is very important when we really talk about peace and war in Kautilya's Arthashastra. The third was really about doing nothing, remaining indifferent. So doing nothing is also a policy, and Kautilya well recognizes that. So when you think that the enemy has 7 constituent elements of the state, is a powerful, strong enemy, and you're not really benefiting from it, the best policy is not to do anything, just be indifferent. The fourth strategy he talks about is undertaking an activity. And undertaking an activity, I would say, is really marching out of your territory to wage a war against a particular entity. So this, I would say, is, yes, indicative of an expansionist design that Kautilya is often accused of. It indeed was a very important activity for the king. But again, this expansionist activity is qualified by Arthashastra, qualified in Kautilya's Arthashastra. Kautilya makes it very clear that only when your state has all the 7 constituent elements in place should you actually go out for a marching activity. This should be well thought of because you're actually taking the people and the resources out from the state. You are not inside your territory, and therefore this is a decision which needs much deliberation. And finally, there is another interesting strategy that Kautilya talks about, which is submitting to the other. And submitting to the other here primarily meant seeking shelter. So this had to be resorted when you were actually threatened from a stronger king, and there was nothing bad with it. And finally, the last strategy which Kautilya talks about is resorting to peace. And here he's saying resorting to peace with the enemies allies. So this is a dual strategy. And this dual strategy is important because you are, while making pact with the enemy, you very much are aspiring also to become a Vijigishu. So the idea of the state here, or the idea of this entity called state, was to really aspire to be central or a Vijigishu, a strong power. But at the same time, the means could be multiple. And I think that's very important. These means, moreover, had to be thought through the 7 constituent elements of the state. And therefore, the state, or the Rajaniti, as I said, was important. Rajaniti, in today's language, I would say governance, was equally important as Kootaniti, which we say diplomacy or statecraft. But I think when we want to talk about Kautilyan diplomacy, we need not just focus on Kootaniti. It was very much standing on the basic edifice on which Rajaniti was operationalized. Thus, I would say that Kautilya's Arthashastra is against inertia, and this is one of the political wisdoms that Kautilya's Arthashastra offers us. I would also say it is about an appraisal of means, the upayas, the upadhas, and the shadgunya. And this again is important because these upayas, the upadhas, and the shadgunya are stratagems which one is familiar in Kautilya's Arthashastra. One needed to adapt to these goals in order to reach specific goals, needed to adopt these means in order to reach specific goals. And definitely, I would say that Arthashastra is about learning the craft of acquiring and also protecting the state from both internal and external threats. So there are 2 conclusions here, perhaps, which comes from the kind of description that I've shared with you. The first is that the notion of order is really central to the understanding of Arthashastra, and this notion of order was anchored on the concept of dharma. And second, and this is again important, that Kautilya's strategy is a web-based strategy. It is a network-based understanding where the notion of relatedness or the notion of interconnectedness informed how governance, that is Rajaniti, and strategy, that is Kootaniti, were to be perceived. So let me just offer you a few concluding thoughts here. The book offers an engagement with concepts used in international relations, and it gives also meaning and insights to understand strategic thought in Arthashastra. We often say there is a debate, in fact, that strategic culture was missing in India, but strategic thought indeed was there, and Kautilya's Arthashastra testifies that. Second, it is also relevant to disciplines such as grand strategy, international relations theory, and political theory. And I think it also offers an excellent opportunity to have a conversation between Western IR and non-Western IR. Third, Arthashastra is indeed a strategic text. But while it is a strategic text, it also offers epistemic insights or epistemic value to concepts which can be employed to theorize the discipline of international relations. And therefore, I would say that the book facilitates a dialogue between meanings associated with the Hindu concept of dharma and how these meanings move when one invokes concepts such as power, morality, and order. So I hope you did enjoy the lecture. Arthashastra is indeed a very instructive text, and students of international relations from the global south should read it. Please make use of the extended reference list that we have provided along with this module. Thank you for your attention.